Čau! Skoraj leto dni je že minilo, odkar se je režiserka Birgitte Stærmose kot gostja oglasila v kinodvorani Akademije za gledališče, radio, film in televizijo v Ljubljani. O njenem igranem celovečernem filmu Camino smo v tej oddaji takrat že spregovorili, o njenem lanskem dokumentarnem filmu Po vojni oziroma Afterwar pa še ne. Tako da danes je torej odlična priložnost za kaj takšnega in naj vas za začetek spomnim, kdo sploh je ta danska režiserka. Izobraževala se je v ZDA, kjer je 14 let tudi delala. Že njeni zgodnji kratki filmi pa so postali uspešni in predvajali so jih na številnih prestižnih festivalih, od Sundancea do Berlina in Rotterdama. Dvakrat je bila nominirana za Evropsko nagrado za najboljši kratki film EFA, dobila pa je nagrade še na festivalih v Melbourneu, Berlinu, Rotterdamu, Štokholmu, na Danskem in drugod. Kot koscenaristka oziroma soscenaristka je sodelovala pri filmu Kristine Rosendal Idealist. Leta 2015 pa je režirala 3 epizode danske igrane serije Norskov Ering, ki so jo predvajali po celi Skandinaviji, v Združenem kraljestvu, ZDA in v Beneluxu. Njen drugi celovečerni film Darling, zgodbo o baletki iz kraljevskega danskega baleta z Danico Čurčič v glavni vlogi, pa je luč sveta ugledal leta 2017 na BFI Londonskem filmskem festivalu. Sodelovala je tudi kot režiserka pri serijah iz platform Netflix in Stars. Ker dokumentarnih filmov skoraj da ne snema, pa je za začetek torej razložila, kako je do tega prišlo. Gre namreč za film o otrocih z ulic Prištine po vojni. Režiserka je otroke najprej spoznala leta 2008, nato pa se je 10 let kasneje vrnila in jih ponovno poiskala. Spremljamo torej njihov razvoj oziroma skupno zgodbo skozi monologe, ki jih otroci govorijo direktno v kamero, kaj tudi odigrajo, včasih celo v sceni s profesionalnimi ali pa amaterskimi igralci. Ne gre torej za povsem dokumentarni film, tako kot ne zares za resnično igrano fikcijo, ampak kot je dejala sama, za performativen dokument posledic, ki jih vojna pusti na ljudeh, tudi ko je vojskovanje že davno končano.
It's been a very long process. The film has been made over a period of 15 years. So in 2006, I think, my son was this big. You know this Klemen, it's like your son probably. And a bit of trouble. And I came home one day with him from daycare, and the phone rang, and it was this man with a strong accent. He said, "Oh, your film has won an award in Kosovo." And I was like, "Where's Kosovo? I don't know." And my child was screaming, and I was a little arrogant, you could call it. And I thought, I need to tend to my child. What is this? And I didn't know my film had been screened in Kosovo. It had been nominated. It was a short fiction that I did that had been nominated for the European Film Awards, and they sent them around like a package. So I had no idea. And sometimes as a filmmaker, you can actually get disassociated from your films in a strange way when people start putting them out, and you're like, "What does that even have to do with me?" So I was a little bit like that. I was like, "Okay, when is this conversation over so I can deal with the screaming child?" And then he said, "Oh, and there's a money prize." And I was like, "Oh, now we can talk." And he said, and there's also, we also ask, and this man is now a very good friend of mine, I should say. He said we should also, we'd like to ask the winning directors to come back the next year to sit on the jury. Very smart move on his part. So because it was just it was Dokufest in Kosovo. It was a very small festival at the time, and they were struggling to get films, and they were struggling to screen them, and it was very much like a sort of a pioneer project at the time. So I thought, "Oh, thank you very much." And I thought, okay, in a year we'll discuss with ourselves. And then he came back the year later and said, "Would you like to come and be on the jury?" And I said, I have this principle with festivals that if it's a place that I have no intention of or chance or way of going, I try to say yes. But if it's Paris or London or something, I'm less interested. So I thought, okay, I'm never going to go to Kosovo otherwise, so I better go. And I was, just to sort of expose how stupid I was. I had to take out the atlas. This was the days of the atlas. There was no internet way of doing this. So I had to take out the atlas, find out where Kosovo was in the world, discover that it was actually in the middle of Europe. I think just to not make myself be too horribly stupid, I had my one child in 95, the other one in 2000. So I was in the midst of having children during the Balkan Wars, and I was living in the U.S. So and in the U.S. it was covered less than in Europe. So I was not reading. Once I had children, I made a decision not to read the newspaper because I thought, what am I going to cut out of this life? It's too full. And I thought, newspapers are going. So I was just blissfully ignorant, and I went, and I mean, no one who doesn't live in a post-war country doesn't tend to go there. It's not an experience that you tend to have. So I went, and I was kind of blown away by the experience of going there. Just the atmosphere, the people I met, this sort of mixture of collective trauma and exuberant young energy. It was just like this sort of all these contrasts, and then it was also just a very sort of pragmatic, because a lot of it was about getting daily life to function, and things were very real, in a way that I really enjoyed. I often say, like I've also traveled in India, which I thoroughly love. And it's a little bit, in India, it can also be this way in some parts, it's like the productions that designer did not arrive. Everything is there for a purpose, but it's not designed or aestheticized or, And where I live in Denmark, it's the production designer has been working overtime for a very long time. So, it's very hard sometimes to sort of just feel the reality of something. So I was really sort of enamored by how real it was. It's just like there was a very sort of close connection between who the people were and what they needed and what they did and how the place was organized. So I was at the festival and met people there, and there was a local filmmaker who said, "Oh, let's do a film together." And I'm not somebody, I don't make documentaries, first of all. I don't go out and make films about people in other countries, ever, either. So it was not, it was not sort of something I was looking for, but at the time, I was very fascinated by certain filmmakers that worked in this staged form. And I thought, wow, so just my filmmaker vanity or sort of greediness thought, oh wow, it would actually be really interesting to work because, when there is this reality that's sort of like undeniably there, you can actually start to work with form more. So I said, okay, let's try and do something. And I said, I'll try and find some money and then we can develop and see if it's anything. So I got a little bit of money, and then the collaboration very quickly collapsed because it turned out that he wanted to do something very journalistic, and I was like, oh, I'm definitely not doing anything journalistic with these kids, So he was like, well, you got to pay me and fuck you. And so he went away. And then all of a sudden I had money to develop a project in Kosovo where I had no connection, So I called up my friend who had invited me to begin with. And I said, Beton, what do I do? I have this money. He knew the guy. I said, he took off, he's like, fuck you. And what do you suggest? And he said, well, I know this young female filmmaker who's really great.
She's now a really prominent Kosovo director, Katrina Krsnici.
Yes, who's now in her own right a very prominent director. I think she won
she's like
the Lion in Venice 2 years ago. So,
you can watch her films on Slovenian HBO all the time. So
yeah. So he said, why don't let's see if Katrina wants to help you. So I hooked up with her, and she helped me do the short in 2008. So we worked together for a couple of years. It was quite a long process to set up the short. So when you see the film, this is a very long answer to a short question.
No, but
yeah, I think it's important to explain.
That, yeah.
So the first part, when they're children, was originally in a slightly different form, a short film that traveled. So it went to a lot of festivals. I think for everybody who worked on it, behind the camera, in front, it was kind of a significant experience. Both the making of the film creatively was significant, meeting the kids was very significant, and the life that the film had afterward was significant. So it sort of was like a landmark. Like, I think for many years I thought, maybe I still think that, that it's probably the best film I make. So what? Okay, whatever. So it was a film, that for all of us, and the DOP that I did it with, we would often talk about just how free it was. Katrina became a friend. It was just something that for everyone that worked on it made a big difference.
Kako pa je prišlo do tega, da je Birgitte odšla nazaj na Kosovo? V filmu Po vojni namreč lahko vidimo protagoniste, ki so bili nekoč otroci. 10 oziroma 15 let kasneje pa so že povsem odrasli ljudje, čeprav se pri njih ni kaj veliko spremenilo, vsaj pri nekaterih ne.
There are many things in life that are not memorable, but this was memorable, right? So it was a very memorable experience for all of us. And, we also had, intense connection to some of the kids, sporadic to others, some we lost contact with. But there was, and sometimes we would help them, with things if they came. And, some of the crew knew some of them. I had contact. And social media started to grow, and I started also following them because I was very curious, like, what's happening with you? And they would follow me. And, so there was this sort of loose connection, but nothing formalized. And then when we approached sort of the 10-year mark, I got very curious about, what does it mean to have their life over a longer period of time? So the first thing that sort of inspired me to try and do a new film with them was that I thought, okay, here's an opportunity to tell something that when we do normal storytelling, we're not very good at. We're not so good at telling stories that actually are truthful about sort of what happens in people's lives. Like the Hollywood model is very much about, you have a conflict, you resolve it, and actually there's something to look forward to, right? That we like stories like that. They make us feel good. If you want to get funding, people also prefer for you to tell stories like that. And I thought, shit, these people are not exactly living that story, right? But I didn't know exactly what they were living. So, but I thought there's actually, and also, I could see some of them became very religious. One guy, he was in Cologne. I was like, how did he get to Cologne? What is he doing in Cologne? I'm a very curious person. I got very curious about what was going on. And sometimes, they would pop up in different places, and I was like, what are you doing there? So I got a little bit of just seed money to go back together with Katrina at that time and Garci, and who also worked on the first film, and we looked everybody up. We met with them, we showed them the old film because they were kids then, now they were adults, and talked to them about how was the experience when we did the original film. And also just talk to them about what their lives were like, and also I asked them if I could do audio interviews with them again, which is how I can get back to how it's built up, but how the old film is made is based on audio interviews. So
maybe after this question
we can talk a little bit about the form,
like the method,
yeah. So I mean, and I asked them if they were at all interested in doing another film. Like, was this something that they wanted to repeat or get into again, or would they rather we went away? And pretty much all of them wanted to participate. There were some that thought we should go away. Largely some of the girls in the old film, had moved. Their lives had moved in a direction where they completely had hidden their past. And the original film was never shown in Kosovo. So they, were not interested. And one guy, the guy who had been in Cologne, who then was in Iceland, who had become a bit of a wheeler dealer type, he was like, are you going to pay me 40,000 or what? So that also didn't work. I was like, we can't get into that kind of enterprise with you. That's not what we're doing. But so then I started, and that was probably in 17, maybe 18. Then I started to develop a new film with them.
Ker gre za bolj kot ne dokumentarni film, ki je na pol igran in na pol fiktiven, ter posnet na malo drugačen način, je Stærmose razložila tudi, na kakšen način ga je naredila.
The speaking into the camera, so I knew when I did the first film that I wanted to do something staged. And in that period when I was developing it, you know, I was spending time, I had been involved in a play in Copenhagen that was sort of inspired by this American play called the Laramie Project. It's probably so long ago that none of you remember this. But the Laramie Project was a play that they did in Laramie, Wyoming, where there had been a killing of a homosexual young guy, a very brutal killing in this small town, done by some of the boys in the small town. I think he was, you know, I don't remember it also. We don't need to get into the gore, but he was murdered in a very gruesome way for being homosexual. And in that town, there was a troupe of actors that went into the town and interviewed all the people in the town about this incident. And then they took all those interviews and they did monologues that then the actors themselves performed. So it's sort of like a drama documentary type way of doing a play. And that was called the Laramie Project. I was involved in playing Copenhagen. I was inspired by that because there was a killing of which was sort of the start of sort of the really racism in Denmark. There was a killing of a young Italian backpack tourist who tried to buy some pot and got stabbed, right? We don't really know why, but it just caused a huge uproar in Denmark. And this whole, you know, so with this group of actors, we went in and we interviewed all the people, you know, the drug dealers, the people living on the street, the people living in the grocery store, you know, all. Yeah. And then there was a play made that I was going to direct that where these group of 8 actors would perform all these real characters in this neighborhood. I ended up not directing it because I was offered a film. But anyway, so I was sort of very familiar with this way of working because I'd been involved for a year in a project like that. In the period where I was developing the film, I was, is this too nerdy for you? No. Okay, good. Okay, just making sure.
A room full of nerds.
Okay, that's good. That's good. I prefer the nerdy stuff, so we'll just keep nerding. So I was in that period at a theater festival. I like theater a lot. At a theater festival, and there was a guest play from Belgium, and what the play consisted of was like 20 kids on the stage, and what they did is they stood and they had monologues to the audience where they said everything that adults told them, you know, which ended up being a ridiculous amount of statements, right? Like contradictory, you know, some of it hurtful, some of it ridiculous, some of it very touching. And it was just, they were just basically saying what adults had said to them back to the adults, right? So when I watched that play, I thought, wow, there's something about children speaking to you. We do not expect them to do that. You know, don't talk to me, child. You know, like I'm the adult, you're the child. So I thought, I became very aware of this hierarchy of who should speak and who should not speak. So after I saw that play, I thought, and actually, no, one other thing that also happened when I first came back, because I knew I wanted to use this interview process because of the other play that I've been in. So after I came back and I had interviewed them, and it was, you know, it was heartbreaking. You know, it was very heartbreaking, especially when you got into the details. You know, like, have you been to the forest? I thought that was the most horrible one. No. You know, have you seen the sea? No. You know, like, do you eat dinner with your parents? No. You know, so things like that, sort of the details of their lives became very harsh to experience and to listen to. So when I came home, I wanted to tell people, also partly to sort of work myself through the experience of what they had told me. And what I found was that a lot of people, or actually all people basically, I would start to tell, and I had a lot to tell because I had interviewed them for hours and hours and hours, right? So I would start to tell, and people would very quickly say, oh, that is so sad. I feel so sorry for them. And then they would talk about something else. Like they were not actually willing to listen and be confronted by all the details of it. And I thought this is really interesting, because what that means is that what we do, us Westerners who are privileged, what we do is when somebody is less privileged than us, what we do is we feel like, okay, my job now is to feel pity. Like I have to feel sorry for this person now. That's my position, right? And I actually got very annoyed and angry about that. I thought it's not fair. And I also thought, because I knew the kids, I thought they don't care. You know, like they could not care less whether you feel sorry or happy or joyful, or you can feel what the fuck you want, right? It was completely irrelevant, I thought. So I thought, here's a mechanism between them and us, where what we perform, now I'm talking about Danes, people like me, what we perform is a ritual that's meaningless for them, right? And I think that's what we do in society. We often, so I have a real, anti-sentimentalizing people's conditions filter. I hate it for this reason, because I actually don't think that all of us, crying on behalf of people suffering in the world makes a difference. I really don't. I think we could do something else, right? I think that's like the wrong approach, and I think we do it because we want to feel better. Like we want some catharsis, right? So we see children, dying in way too big numbers in Gaza, and we want to cry over it. I'm like, why? Don't cry over it. Try and stop it. So I just, so I really thought actually so then I thought, what do they need? Well, I thought what they really need, partly in their lives, just in their own country, but also in relationship to the audience watching the film, they need to be recognized for the humanity that they have. Like, I think when we feel pity for somebody, we also take some of the full range of emotion and humanity away from them. Because we say, okay, now this person is somebody we feel sorry for, right? Which means that they don't quite have the full range of opportunity or emotional life or opportunity that we have. I think there's a diminishing in the feeling sorry for somebody. So I thought, and what we don't want to think about, the people I was telling what they didn't want to think about, what would it actually, like how, if I have to put myself in the shoes of a child who never has dinner with their parents, like what is that life? And they didn't want to think about that. Or, like how do you start to think about life and death and hope if you're in their shoes? Like we would think like, well, maybe they don't have so much time to think about that. I can have existential angst, but they can't, So I think just, like how existential are you allowed to be? I think there's some hierarchy to that, So all these things kind of created the form. So it was a lot about the audience for me, and maybe that's why I also do TV. I do care about the audience, So there was a lot about the audience, like my mother who refused to talk about it, I wanted her to just not be able to look away, right? So I wanted the film to have a form where you couldn't look away, or you couldn't feel sorry, or you couldn't put up these defense mechanisms that we put up for it not to be too painful, right? So we don't get too harmed by watching it, So that's why I thought, okay, I want them to speak to the camera, like I want them to address us directly, right? Yeah. And then in the process of doing the film, I went to Kosovo to do what we called a casting, which was not a casting, but it was because they were very shy, and this was a long, process over a year to even be able to take a still camera out and take a picture. It took maybe half a year. So it was a long process. So before we sort of set out to film, I thought, okay, I need to have some knowledge of what does it mean when you start to film, like how is this interaction going to work? Like how can I do it where it feels right? can I give them a sentence they can memorize? I didn't know. How does it feel? So, and also for them to just have half an hour where that happened, and see, was it okay for them, right, to be filmed that way? So we went down and we called it a casting, and all the kids that we had interviewed who wanted to be in the film were in the casting, and we cast them all, I should say, so people don't think we didn't select somebody. We cast them all, but some of the kids, when they came in, really couldn't speak up. Like they were like, like they couldn't. And I just said, well, why don't you whisper it instead? So it was just a practical thing during this casting session where I thought, well, to help them do what they wanted to do, I said, try and whisper it instead. And then when we came home, we were like, wow, that's really effective. Like it has a special feeling when they whisper to you, because it's like an extra, it's like a
layer of
intimacy.
Yeah.
It's a layer of intimacy so this thing that I wanted to achieve with them actually talking to you, but also I also wanted the audience to have an intimacy with them, was enhanced by this whispering.
Kako pa je potekalo pisanje scenarija, ustvarjanje zgodbe?
So first of all, the interviews that I did in a very schematic way. So it wasn't like me sitting down, asking different questions, because first of all, I don't speak Albanian. So Katrina did the interviews, but I needed to have some, control or some way of understanding what was happening. And I also, because I knew I wanted to get to sort of more existential issues. Like I didn't want to stay in the mundane every day. I wanted to get into the existential, the spiritual part of their life, because I feel like, the spiritual part or the existential part of their life is the thing that in a way they're denied the most. Mm-hmm. That we deny acknowledging that they have on the same level that we have it. Yeah. Partly because they're children and partly because of their situation. And I've had to describe the film as, children who sell things on the street. It's really rude. But I've had to do it to make people understand, otherwise it got too complicated. But in a way, they're in their lives, they're kind of marked by these, what do you call that? Labels that are put on them, rather than sort of their full-fledged humanity. So the interviews were structured. I used these Proust questions that you probably, do you know them? It's like these questions that he would answer once a year. Is that the story? I think, what's your favorite food,
We know it because it's in one of the radio shows they use with guests.
Yes, a lot.
Proust questionnaire in the radio studio.
Yeah, also I think the Actors Studios. Yeah. The Actors Studios use it at the end, Vanity Fair uses it for interviews. People use, so it's a superficial thing in a way. It's not, so it's Proust, but it wasn't a deep choice. It was a more superficial choice, but I thought, okay, these questions you can ask anybody, right? They're not in any way colored by what I want to know or what they want to say. They're generic in a way. And they are meant to bring out some specific humanity of this person. So I thought, okay, I'm going to use these questions, and I added some questions. Like I added one question, which was like, because they were children and were even more children or younger children during the war, like, what do you remember? I was curious, like, what were the images that they had? So they were all asked the same set of questions. And I actually, when I also interviewed them as adults, I used the same questions. Again. So and the way, with the longer film, the way I worked with it, it's filmed over a period of 3 years. So I would film, I would interview, I would write bits of script, I would show it to them, discuss it with them. We would film, then I would edit, then I would interview, write. So this process was repeated many times, partly to find the language of the film, but also to find the story. So I didn't sit down to say, okay, this is going to be a story about them fleeing. I didn't have opinions like that. I was sort of more exploring. So in that way, the documentary part of the film is this exploration in the reality. But actually, right now, I'm writing a pure fiction film in the same method. So you could use it for writing a pure fiction film. I'm interviewing my family members, my father's ancient siblings, about something that happened in the 50s. So, you could also do that. And again, there I'm doing it to sort of try and get as much detail and specificity and things that might surprise me rather than me coming up with it. I find it liberating.
Hvala za pozornost in do prihodnjič. Lep pozdrav.